Part 3 of lecture 6. So in the previous two parts, we talked about decision trees and random forests. And we're going to start something that's completely different. And it's actually a lot simpler than the things that we did before. It's called k-nearest neighbor. And it's actually surprisingly good. And so the idea is, if we have a large training set, why do we need any model? Like, we can just, when we get a new instance, we can just figure out in the training set, like, which one is closest to the new instance, and then we just copy the label. And that idea is, as the name suggests, k-nearest neighbor. We're going to find k-nearest neighbor, and then let the neighbors say vote, and then use the result to classify our new instance. So the idea is very simple. There's no need to train. Training is basically, I just remember the training set, and then I use the whole training set when we actually classify new stuff, and that's basically it. And the only thing that I want to talk about is, what do I mean by nearest? So what is closest or nearest actually mean? So what kind of distance function should we use? So usually we use the Euclidean distance, and we also call it L2 distance. And I want to introduce some other distance function, so that's why I'm talking about here. So those distance function will be useful later. So as I said, the most common one is just take the difference, square, sum, and square root. And another example that we will use a lot later in the term is the Manhattan distance. So we just take the absolute value difference, and we do not take the square root. Why do we want this? Because it's very easy to compute. And why is it called Manhattan distance? So if you look at a map of Manhattan, you will see that the city blocks look like this, look like grids. So if we go back, and if we want to get, say, from here to here, the distance we need to travel is not this Euclidean distance, which is this thing. We're not going to do that. We need to travel like this. Or maybe you want to do like this. But it turns out if you sum up these ones, it's the same as this. If you sum up these ones, it's the same as that. So basically it's the same. It's just the x1 value difference, absolute value, and x2 difference in absolute value, and sum it up. So that's the Manhattan distance, and also it's called L1 distance. And if we combine these, I don't actually need a diagram. If we combine these, they are basically the LP distances. So they are usually called P norms. This is the same thing. And when P is 1, it's just the Manhattan distance. P is 2 is the Euclidean one. So the very interesting one is the infinity one. And in case they are infinity, it's not clear what it really is. So we're going to define this as just the maximum. So basically, if you want the distance between these 2 points, I'm going to compute this and just use this maximum as our distance. And we can actually use different p, but p cannot be smaller than 1. So as I explained, the algorithm is very easy to implement. You don't need to do anything in training. And when we are classifying new points, we're going to just measure the distance from the new point to each of the existing points, and order them basically according to distance. And we would use the majority label to label the new instance. So if you want to look at a diagram, so suppose we have the training point as these, then the classification boundary with one nearest neighbor. So if we're only using one, the actual nearest neighbor, then the classification boundary will be like this, which is kind of actually very complicated. And if we start with something else, then it will be like this, and so on. Let me try different ones. And some of them make sense, some of them does not. And we can get something, for example, here, if we try 2 nearest neighbor, there will be parts of this that cannot be classified, say, for sure, because so the 2 nearest neighbor, one of them is green, one of them is red, so I don't actually know which one to use. And similar for 3 and maybe 4 and 5. So it seems they are kind of similar if you increase the number of neighbors. So one special case is if you use the same number of neighbors as the number of points, then you are basically classifying everything just as the majority label. So that would be a special case. And in general, one nearest neighbor would probably say overfit, and if you increase, it will become kind of worse, but it will at least try not to overfit. And also here you can try different number of classes. You can try L1 or L2, so they shape differently, and so on. I think that's all I want to talk about, actually.